This is TrojanVision One-on-One. Today's featured guest, internationally known artist Nall Hollis. Now, here's your host, Aaron Taylor.
Welcome to TrojanVision One-on-One. I'm your host, Aaron Taylor, and my guest is Pike County native and world-renowned artist Nall Hollis. Nall, thank you for joining us on One-on-One.
Hi, Aaron. How are you?
I'm doing just fine.
Good.
I'll be even better when we talk a little bit about your art and your legacy, and the legacy that is here at Troy University and the Nall Museum here on campus. So let's talk a little bit about that. First off, how do you feel about
Is that
having,
what it is?
Yeah, that's
a legacy?
what it is.
Good.
Is it your legacy? I mean, I assume
I
it
did
would
the
be.
work.
You did the work. So let's talk about how this all came about and the relationship that you have with Chancellor and Mrs. Hawkins that kind of led to this taking place here at Troy University.
Well, the legacy started years ago. I started saving my better pieces because I've have been to so many museums in Europe in the last 45 years where I've been living. It's like, why don't they show the good work of these people instead of these little secondary cutouts of Matisse and blow them up big? Mm-hmm. Why don't they give some of his great works in the Matisse Chapel? And I said, well, those were old people when they did them, and they didn't want to do anything but sit in a wheelchair and cut things out. That's all they could do. So having that as an education, I decided to save my best pieces at an early age and keep them. And if somebody wanted to buy them, do another copy of that and sell them that. And that's what I've done for all these years. So I knew that they would all be brought together somewhere, because I traveled a lot. And I knew that I wanted the best pieces represented. So I would just keep those pieces. And I think I had been the artist in resident in Alabama, and the Hawkins knew that I was from Troy. And so I got a call one day from Jack Hawkins, and Chancellor Hawkins. And he said, no, why don't you come back to Troy where you belong? And be artist in resident for us. And I said, sure. When? Well, in a few months. So I came back from France, and I think I was living in Huntsville the part of the year I was in the United States, which was usually about 3 months a year. And I came back and enjoyed visiting Murphy Street, where my grandmothers lived and where I was brought up, and going out to Hillcrest and visiting the cemeteries and, going and saying hello to my father's grave and my grandparents, and all of my grandparents were buried here. And I enjoyed that. It was, the smells, seeing the kudzu, seeing the oak trees, even though on Murphy Street most of them have been cut down, regretfully so. Murphy Park has been totally renovated. It's not the same thing. But there was a connection that I had to Troy. And what was the question?
But how did that relationship lead to where we are now, to the museum being here?
Well, I stayed in Troy. I love Troy. The Hawkins are fabulous people. I was treated very well by all the people here. And it was fun to revisit my childhood past, especially after being in France for many years. And then they said, would you come back next year? And I said, sure. And then they said, okay. I said, but that's all I can do is 2 years, because I've got other places that I've got to be and got to go. So I did that, and while I was here, I found Bebe and Ken Hendricks. I found some other cousins that I love very much, and stayed with them. I brought my wife then over here, and of course she was European, and really said, well, this is an ethnic journey. And I said, well, good. I'm glad that you enjoy your ethnic journey back to Troy. And so later on, I came here for something, I forget what, and Janice and Jack Hawkins, they said, well, can you come over and visit and see if the old dining hall would be suitable for a museum? And I came over, and we went to Auburn because they had recently built their museum, and I said, well, you know, that there's a beautiful building for something, maybe for orchids or something, because it's all glass and there's no walls to hang on in Auburn. And it's way away from campus, and most students don't have cars. And so how are the kids going to get there? And so this was right on campus, the building here, the cafeteria, because I'd eaten there every day as an artist in resident. And I said, this is perfect. The windows are narrow. They have a lot of wall space, big open spaces. And you know, you could put little dividing things or these boxes and hang things all over them. I said, the space is perfect. But you need northern light, so if there are any artist studios that you plan to build here, they've got to be all glass facing that gully with the kudzu. So greenery and a few electric boxes out on the grounds. I said, but other than that, it's perfect. So that's the way they went. And then I sent over a dove, a big Rosa Parks dove that I had done for the Puccini. No, not for Puccini. It was the St. Francis of Assisi show in 2005, right after the World Trade Center went down and things were happening. There was a lot of noise about the Muslims and the Christians and the battle and living in France. You saw it directly. You know, we had front row seats to North Africa across the Mediterranean. And it was like essential that peace dove, as I did it for the Basilica of St. Francis, come over here to Alabama, because we have the same problem, but we call it something else. And it just happened. So that was the first piece. And then the artist portraits that I had done, hoping to create a legacy for all Alabama artists, because, you know, roll tide and throw that pass and hit that home run and all, you know, get that basketball shot. But where are the arts?
Yes.
Where are the arts in Alabama? The only thing we knew as kids was how to weave baskets and make gimp jewelry, you know, and go to the creek and get some mud.
But seeing that art and having that art on display and leaving a legacy of art, I know that's got to be something. I know it touches you, and I've heard you talk about it before. Having your work in a place where everybody can see it from now on.
Well, I did the same thing in France. I built my own museum. And because you had to be part of the École de Nice to even get the attention of the government to put you in a museum. It's pretty much the same here. It's kind of a mafia-run thing of big galleries, training people like Leo Castelli, had a school of museum directors trained in Chicago, and all the hopeful curators would go to that school, and they gave them a textbook of who to promote and who not to promote. And the beneficiary was Leo Castelli Gallery, who created Andy Warhol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Jim Dine. And I said, you know, there's got to be another way that other artists from little towns that are not part of this big gallery museum system, this mafia, this money mafia, can be educated as to what is art. There's got to be a way to do it. And Troy was the perfect place. It was a hometown. I had saved all the work. They needed something in the arts more than what they had. And I thought, this is where I'm giving all this stuff, because that's my town.
And what did it
That's
feel
my
like?
state.
Well, what did it feel like the first time you walked into the finished gallery and saw?
It was like a child. I walked in and I said, I am so happy to see this many textures, pretending that I was a kid and looking at it with fresh eyes and seeing all of this where all we had was books in the library to flip through and go to the Louvre through a book. Well, after living half the time in the Louvre, jogging, I would jog inside the Louvre because the students of the Beaux-Arts would get free passes. And I'd go over there and jog in the walls, looking at different, stopping here and there, doing a quick sketch of a Franz Hall expression of a portrait, and then jogging on and going to Mona Lisa, of course, because she's very famous. And, you know, looking at her and trying to find something special. Why is she the orchid of all that particular time of painting. Why is she the one that was selected? Because she was photographed the most. Probably some of his other portraits were as good, but they weren't chosen to be photographed. And so I said, you know, I'm glad I chose the best stuff to put in this place, to give to Troy.
Now let's talk a little bit about one of your most recent pieces. That's the topic and the subject is well known to people in this area, and that's Rosa Parks.
Yes.
And let's talk a little bit about this piece and how it came about.
Well, how it came about is being from Alabama and Rosa's story being from Alabama, it was obligatory that they would coincide one day or another. So let's just say that the future held the meeting already, you know, it was like destiny that this would happen, is representing probably all of the people in Alabama. If you've been in Alabama for 4 generations, all 4 grandparents were born here. And one of my grandparents was racially educated, as most people in Alabama were. One was a racist, one was not a racist. My father, having black Native American blood and German blood, was a racist because he was taught to be a racist, but he didn't realize he was being a racist against himself. And I think that's so true with different races in Alabama. We're all mongrels. We're all a mixture of everything because we're Americans. And if we've been here a long time, we've had enough time for the races to blend in together.
And now that kind of comes through in the piece. And that eventually, some of the stories and things you're telling the story of Rosa Parks.
Well, having experienced the injustice and the horror, what can we do? We accept the commission. And so excuse me, I'm an emotional artist.
Oh,
so
not a problem with
this will
that.
happen probably several times, no matter what we talk about.
Yeah.
But it's like, I feel that touching the problem that we have as human beings of accepting who we are and then learning to love who we are was a deep-rooted necessity for everybody to be able to breathe comfortable air. When I think I was in Sigma Nu fraternity, the University of Alabama, we drove down to a football game, the fraternity girls, fraternity boys and sorority girls with our little pins on, in my mother's, you know, 4-door Cadillac with a little round window in the back. And we got to a dead end in New Orleans. And I think we were on some drug, I forget what it was, grass, marijuana, whatever. And we were just stoned, and we got to this dead end, and the black kids were playing basketball. And we came to a stop. We were playing with the electric windows. This was in 1964, when most cars were roll-ups. And I saw the most blatant look of hatred coming to me from these black basketball kids, that I didn't realize that that's the way that they felt. That's the only way they could feel, because they had lived the experience as we had lived the privileged experience of looking down. And it was like, what? Why are you looking at me like that? And we left. And that was the moment I decided I had to leave the United States. I couldn't bear it.
And so racial issues is what kind of guided you down the path where you are today.
It catapulted me into reality, because I was living a very white bread life. It was viewed from one position and not the other side. And so my question then was, when my father died, he said, I have something horrible news to share with you. He was on his deathbed with cancer, you know, too much cigarettes, too much alcohol, and, you know, just degeneration. And I said, what? He said, it's really bad what I'm going to say. I said, what? He said, you have Indian blood. I said, Daddy, wow, that's fabulous. He said, but it's also rumored that the Indian had black blood. I said, Daddy, this is everything I've been waiting to hear. I mean, I am so lucky. That's why I was uncomfortable being placed in a position of the isolated white privileged class of everything.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little about the work itself. Give us a little bit of a description about what went into the piece and what we're seeing here.
Well, as a symbolic painter, this was a perfect subject for me. And it's Alabama, it was the racist, and obviously Rosa Parks was not a pure African American. She had white blood. She was a mulatto, or she was a mixed breed like myself. So I said, well, you know, that's nice. It's nice. And I used to wonder what all the chit-chat was about in the kitchen of my grandmother, of black and this lighter colored, and they would talk amongst themselves. And I was, of course, the kid that was always listening. So I identified with Rosa on many levels. And then she was working toward equalizing the scales, or if you want, coming to terms with education of the American, which, living in Europe for 45 years, I realized that we are so poorly educated, but at least we're not hypocritical. Where the French are hypocritical, they are racist against the North Africans, but they would never admit it. And they say, we're not racist. And I said, excuse me, I've only lived here for 45 years and you're nothing but, we're the most horrible kind of racist because you deny that you're racist. So at least about Alabama has carried the burden of racism on its shoulders when, you know, George Washington and Adams and all of those people were importing slaves. And I'm reading a book now called New York, and it's the whole story of New York City and how they had to run the Indians, I use the old term, Indians, rather than, I'm not talking about India like Bombay and Delhi. I'm talking about Native Americans. And it's like seeing the whole history of the United States being unveiled. I read a book years ago, the Real History of the United States, or something like that, and I was shocked to learn all these things, that it was printed, and why didn't we get those books when we were kids? So to be able to work on this was a passion. It was a passion of justice.
And some of the elements of it, in the picture, we're seeing pieces of magazines. We're seeing
well, these
elements.
magazines, I had to find photographs of Rosa. And so I ordered these National Geographic magazines for children. And I would just go through these, and it was just wonderful to find all these faces. I had done portraits for Alabama Southern Community College of Martin Luther King, but all these subjects that were related, Truman Capote, who else? There were two other portraits that I did, and I forget who they were, because my memory's going. And it was just like, let me go back into that passionate world of work, because when you're painting flowers for wealthy clients to eat, because that's how I eat, I sell paintings. I don't inherit. I've always lived from my art since I started painting outside of college. In fact, even as a student, some of the galleries in Paris would say, oh, this is the model that models at the Beaux-Arts. Come back when you do professional work. I said, this will be professional in 50 years or less, because I did it, and that's all I do. And I intend to continue living from my artwork. So you want to sell it or not? And so about 6 months later, they would say, we'll take it now, and they would sell it and have sellout shows. But it's like growing up as an artist and growing up as an uncomfortable racist raised on the white side of the fence was a burden that I didn't want to carry.
We say this, it's not an end, because you're still creating, you're still working, but seeing the stuff from the beginning to where you are now.
But that's a progression.
Yes.
Of to tell kids, I was so untrained and there was no education for art. as a kid. Any anatomy, architecture, color, you know, you could make a color wheel, but you didn't do impressionistic paintings. You didn't have the philosophy behind it. And you didn't have it's like a musician going to classical musical school and then maybe end up banging on the drums. Didn't make any difference. He had that classical background. It was to try to give a classical background through an example that you could feel and touch to the kids.
And that's what they have the opportunity in small town Troy to walk in and see world-class art thanks to you and your work and your donation and legacy here at Troy University.
Well, it's such an honor and a privilege to be able to be honored this way too.
And so anyone wants the opportunity to see the work, it's in the International Arts Center.
As we were speaking before,
Yes.
you said, you have a child, and I said, well, you know, I elected not to have children, but to have my children come out of my hands rather than my wife's womb.
Yes.
And here they are.
And
They're
you see
scattered
them
all over the world.
All over the world, but the biggest collection of them here in Troy, Alabama. And folks can see it at the International Arts Center at the Nall Museum.
The biggest and the best pieces.
The biggest and the best pieces. So opportunity to check it out. Nall, it's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed talking to you about your work, and I'm sure our viewers have enjoyed listening a little bit about yourself and how it came
Thanks to
about.
Jack and Janice Hawkins that have done so much for here. And everywhere they've been, they have done it through God.
Thank you for being here, and I've appreciated it. I know our viewers have, and I hope they get a chance to see your art in person and enjoy it for themselves. Thank you for being here today. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Trojan Vision One-on-One.